On October 17, 1944, at 5:12 hours, a single U.S. Army combat medic from an infantry regiment operating in Western Europe entered a shallow tree line on the eastern edge of a low ridge. The ridge ran north-south for approximately 620 meters, with a gradual eastern slope and a sharper western fall toward a narrow road. Elevation at the crest measured roughly 312 meters above sea level. The terrain consisted of wet loam soil, leaf litter from deciduous trees, and intermittent limestone outcroppings. Visibility at ground level was limited to 40 to 60 meters due to undergrowth and early morning mist. The medic carried no rifle. His primary equipment consisted of a medical aid bag weighing approximately 14 kilograms when fully stocked. Inside were sulfa powder packets, morphine syringes with metal needle guards, bandages, compress dressings, plasma units sealed in glass bottles, and iodine applicators. He also carried a standard-issue M1911A1 pistol for personal defense, chambered in .45 ACP, with a 7-round magazine inserted and 1 spare magazine in a pouch. The pistol weighed 1.1 kilograms unloaded. The trigger pull averaged 5.5 pounds, with a short, single-action break. He did not expect to use it. Weather conditions were stable but unfavorable. The temperature at 5 o'clock was approximately 6 degrees Celsius. Humidity exceeded 85%. A low cloud ceiling diffused light evenly, eliminating sharp shadows. Wind speed was negligible, estimated at less than 2 kilometers per hour from the northwest. Sound carried unpredictably under these conditions, with damp ground absorbing footfalls while mist distorted distance. The medics unit had advanced into this sector during the night, following artillery preparation that ceased at 3:40. The mission was to hold the ridge until relieved by another battalion advancing from the west. Enemy forces were assessed as withdrawing elements of German infantry division, reinforced with ad hoc defensive positions. Intelligence indicated scattered resistance, machine gun nest-oriented downslope, and limited armored support. No enemy counterattack was expected before daylight. At 5:27, the medic reached the last known rally point, marked by a partially collapsed stone wall. There was no movement. No verbal signals were exchanged. He waited for 2 minutes, scanning the ridge crest from south to north. At 5:29, he detected no friendly presence. He noted spent brass on the ground, .30-06 Springfield casings, consistent with M1 Garrett rifle fire, and several links from disintegrating belts used by a Browning M1919 machine gun. Blood was visible on leaves leading downslope to the west. By 5:34, he moved cautiously along the ridge, stepping deliberately to avoid noise. At 5:41, he encountered the first casualty. The soldier was prone, facing west, helmet still secured. The wound was a high-velocity penetrating injury to the upper thorax. There were no signs of life. The medic did not linger. He marked the position mentally and continued. Between 5:45 and 6:10, he located 4 additional bodies within a 90-meter radius. All were infantrymen from his unit. The distribution of wounds suggested fire from the southwest and south, indicating an enfilading position. There were no defensive positions prepared beyond shallow scrapes. No wounded personnel were calling out. This indicated either rapid incapacitation or enemy proximity, suppressing movement. At 6:18, the medic reached a shallow depression approximately 1.2 meters deep and 3 meters wide. Inside were 2 wounded soldiers. One had suffered a compound fracture to the left femur with arterial bleeding. The other had abdominal shrapnel wounds. Both were conscious but hypothermic. The medic immediately applied a tourniquet proximal to the femoral wound, tightened until arterial bleeding ceased. He administered 1 morphine syringe intramuscularly at 6:22, recording the time by marking the casualty's forehead with a grease pencil. Throughout treatment, the medic maintained intermittent visual scans toward the southwest, where the terrain dropped toward the road. He observed no movement, but heard distant small arms fire at irregular intervals, estimated at 400 to 600 meters away. German doctrine in this sector favored infiltration and flanking rather than mass assault. This suggested enemy elements might already be forward the ridge, conducting mopping-up operations. At 6:31, he applied pressure dressings to the abdominal wounds, using sulfur powder to reduce infection risk. He did not attempt evacuation. No stretcher bearers were available. The radio operator assigned to the platoon was missing. The medic had no means of communication. By 6:45, ambient light increased marginally. The mist thinned but did not clear. The medic repositioned both wounded men slightly deeper into depression to reduce visibility. He removed reflective metal surfaces from their gear. He instructed them through hand pressure and gestures to remain silent. He did not speak. At 6:58, he heard footsteps to the south. The sound pattern suggested boots moving cautiously, with pauses every few steps. He froze. The wounded men ceased movement. The medic lay prone, pressing into wet soil. At 7:02, the footsteps receded, moving downslope. No voices were heard. This indicated enemy patrols operating independently, likely in pairs or small fire teams. From 7:05 to 8:20, the medic remained stationary. He monitored respiration and bleeding. He adjusted bandages as swelling increased. He rationed plasma, deciding not to administer due to the risk of movement and the limited supply. Fatigue accumulated. He had not slept since the previous night. His hands were numb from cold and moisture, reducing tactile sensitivity. At 8:34, distant artillery fire resumed to the east, beyond the ridge. Shell impacts were not visible but audible, with a delay consistent with several kilometers' distance. This suggested a broader engagement developing, increasing the likelihood of enemy forces sweeping the ridge to secure their rear. The medic assessed the situation without haste. His unit was gone. Relief was uncertain. He was responsible for 2 wounded men who could not move. Enemy discovery remained a constant risk. He adjusted his position to maintain a low silhouette and continued to wait. The ridge remained quiet. The day advanced incrementally. No conclusion was yet visible. At 8:47 on October 17, 1944, the medic detected a change in the acoustic pattern along the ridge. Individual rifle shots gave way to controlled bursts of automatic fire, each lasting 2 to 3 seconds. The cadence was consistent with the MG-42 general-purpose machine gun, firing 7.92 by 57 millimeters Mauser ammunition at a cyclic rate exceeding 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound originated from the southwest, approximately 300 meters downslope, and traversed laterally from south to north over a span of several minutes. This indicated a German fire team advancing, while providing suppressive fire, to probe for remaining resistance. The medic remained prone. He checked the tourniquet on the femoral wound at 8:51, tightening it by 1 additional rotation to counter renewed bleeding caused by muscle spasm. The wounded soldier's pulse was rapid but present. Skin temperature was cold. The abdominal casualty exhibited shallow breathing at a rate of approximately 22 breaths per minute, with intermittent coughing. No blood was visible externally, suggesting internal hemorrhage. At 9:03, the medic heard metallic contact against stone to the west, followed by low voices. The language was German. The volume suggested conversation rather than shouted commands, indicating perceived local superiority. The medic did not understand the words, but noted pauses consistent with map consultation or terrain orientation. Enemy doctrine in this period emphasized decentralized command at the squad level, allowing patrol leaders to make immediate decisions. From 9:10 to 9:42, the medic observed no direct movement within his field of view, which extended roughly 35 meters through sparse underbrush. Light conditions improved incrementally as the mist lifted. Visibility increased to approximately 80 meters in open areas, but remained constrained within the tree line. Sun angle was low, casting diffuse illumination from the east. The ridge crest still provided concealment, but less cover than earlier. At 9:47, a single rifle shot cracked from the north. The report was sharper and less reverberant than the MG bursts, consistent with a bolt-action carabiner 98K. The medic counted 3 seconds before hearing a second shot, suggesting deliberate fire rather than suppression. He inferred an enemy marksman engaging a detected target, possibly another isolated survivor. At 9:52, a body fell into view downslope, approximately 60 meters west of the medic's position. The fall was uncontrolled, followed by no further movement. The medic noted the absence of return fire. This reinforced the assessment that organized resistance had ceased. Between 10 o'clock and 11:15, the medic experienced extended periods of inactivity punctuated by distant movement. He rationed his attention, alternating between scanning and monitoring the wounded. Fatigue manifested as slowed reaction time and increased difficulty maintaining focus. He adjusted his posture periodically to restore circulation to his limbs, doing so in increments of a few centimeters to avoid detection. At 10:28, he administered a second morphine syringe to the femoral casualty, spacing the dose according to standard field protocol. He marked the time discreetly on a scrap of cloth tucked into the soldier's collar. He did not administer morphine to the abdominal casualty due to respiratory compromise. At 10:41, wind shifted slightly from the west at approximately 5 kilometers per hour. Leaves rustled intermittently, masking small sounds but also carrying scent. The medic applied mud to exposed skin and equipment to reduce odor contrast. He covered the wounded men's faces with damp cloth to prevent involuntary movement from insects and debris. At 11:02, a German patrol entered the ridge crest from the south. The medic detected them visually at a distance of approximately 70 meters. There were 3 soldiers. They moved in a staggered formation, spacing of roughly 8 meters between individuals. Each carried a carabiner 98K rifle with fixed bayonet. One soldier carried a submachine gun, likely an MP40, identifiable by its shorter barrel and box magazine. Their pace was deliberate, weapons held at the low ready. The patrol halted at 11:05 near a cluster of trees 50 meters from the medic's position. One soldier knelt and scanned downslope. Another adjusted his helmet strap. The third consulted a folded map. The medic remained motionless. His breathing rate slowed deliberately. He noted the direction of their gaze and adjusted his body alignment to minimize profile. At 11:11, the patrol advanced again, angling westward. They did not approach the depression containing the wounded. This suggested their sweep pattern prioritized the ridge line rather than lower ground. The medic did not move until they disappeared from sight at 11:18. From 11:20 to 12:40, the medic remained in place. Hunger became noticeable. He consumed no rations to avoid noise and scent. He sipped water sparingly from a canteen, timing each movement to coincide with wind gusts or distant artillery. At 12:53, artillery fire intensified to the east. Shells detonated at intervals of 20 to 30 seconds. The direction of sound indicated a front line stabilizing several kilometers away. This reduced the likelihood of immediate friendly relief. German forces would likely consolidate control of rear areas, including the ridge. At 13:07, the medic observed a second patrol, this time approaching from the west along the road below the ridge. Dust and exhaust fumes suggested vehicle movement earlier, though no vehicles were visible now. The patrol consisted of 4 soldiers, one carrying a light machine gun, likely an MG-34, identifiable by its slimmer barrel profile. They paused frequently, scanning uphill. The medic assessed the risk of discovery increasing. He considered relocation, but rejected it due to the wounded men's condition. Movement would expose them to observation and noise. He chose to remain and adapt concealment. Between 13:15 and 14:30, the patrol conducted a systematic sweep. They advanced upslope in short bounds, stopping every 10 to 15 meters. At 13:48, they reached a point approximately 30 meters from the medic's position. One soldier knelt and examined the ground, touching disturbed leaves and soil. The medic noted sweat forming despite the cold. His grip on the earth tightened involuntarily, then relaxed. At 13:56, the soldier stood and moved on without signaling. The patrol shifted northward, leaving the medic's sector untouched. By 14:12, they were no longer visible. At 14:20, the medic adjusted bandages again. The femoral casualty showed signs of shock: pale skin, rapid pulse, shallow breathing. The abdominal casualty was semi-conscious, responding only to pressure. The medic administered plasma at 14:27, using a glass bottle suspended from a branch within the depression. He monitored flow rate carefully to avoid overload. From 14:30 onward, the ridge grew quieter. Enemy movement became less frequent but more deliberate. The medic remained alone with the wounded, aware that the threat had not diminished but become more controlled. The afternoon progressed without resolution. The medic continued to wait, conserving strength and attention, preparing for further contact as daylight slowly declined. At 15:02 hours on October 17, 1944, the medic detected a distinct alteration in enemy behavior. The ambient quiet was interrupted by the deliberate snapping of branches to the north, followed by brief pauses. This pattern differed from earlier patrol movement. It suggested intentional noise, a method sometimes employed to provoke movement from concealed survivors. The medic remained motionless. He did not respond. At 15:11, a single German soldier appeared at the northern edge of the medic's field of view, approximately 55 meters away. He was crouched, moving laterally rather than forward, scanning low ground rather than the ridge crest. His posture indicated caution but not urgency. The soldier carried a carabiner 98K with slings shortened, rifle held close to the chest. No bayonet was fixed. The medic tracked the movement with peripheral vision only, avoiding direct gaze. The wounded men did not move. Their breathing remained audible only at close range. The medic adjusted his own breathing to a slower rhythm, inhaling through the nose, exhaling through partially closed lips to reduce sound. At 15:18, a second soldier appeared behind the first, maintaining a distance of approximately 10 meters. This spacing indicated a two-man reconnaissance element rather than a full patrol. Their movement suggested they were following signs rather than sweeping blindly. The medic inferred they were responding to earlier indicators of contact, bodies, blood trails, or disturbed ground. At 15:24, the lead soldier halted and raised his hand. Both men froze. The medic observed the lead soldier kneel and examine the ground. The distance closed to approximately 42 meters. The medic's position remained concealed by a fallen tree trunk and undergrowth, but the depression containing the wounded was not fully obscured from this angle. At 15:27, the medic made a single adjustment. He pressed the wounded men deeper into the depression by applying downward pressure on their shoulders and legs, shifting them approximately 15 centimeters lower. This was done slowly, over the course of 40 seconds, synchronized with a light breeze that rustled leaves. At 15:32, the second soldier moved forward and whispered something to first. The words were inaudible. Their tone was low. The medic noted that neither soldier raised his weapon fully. This indicated uncertainty rather than confirmed contact. At 15:38, the lead soldier advanced another 5 meters. He was now within 37 meters of the medic's position. At this range, visual detection was possible if movement occurred. The medic remained prone, face turned slightly away to avoid eye contact that could reflect light. At 15:41, the soldier stopped abruptly. He looked downslope rather than toward the depression. A sound had drawn his attention. Distant artillery fired to the east, followed by a low rumble. The distraction lasted approximately 12 seconds. At 15:43, the soldier turned back toward the ridge crest and gestured for the second soldier to reposition. They shifted their axis of advance, angling northwest instead of continuing directly forward. The medic recognized this as a decision to bypass uncertain terrain rather than commit to a close search. By 15:49, both soldiers had moved out of sight. The medic did not relax. He waited an additional 15 minutes before adjusting his position or attending to the wounded. At 16:07, he checked the plasma flow. The bottle was nearly empty. He clamped the line and removed the needle with controlled pressure to prevent bleeding. He applied a compressed dressing and secured it with adhesive tape, minimizing noise. At 16:18, the light began to shift noticeably. The sun angle lowered, increasing shadow length. Visibility within the trees decreased unevenly, creating alternating bands of light and dark. This favored concealment, but also increased the risk of sudden close contact. At 16:26, the medic heard footsteps again, this time from the west. The cadence was faster than earlier patrols, with less frequent pauses. This suggested a larger element, moving with confidence. At 16:31, 3 soldiers emerged into view at a distance of approximately 60 meters. One carried an MP-40 submachine gun. Another carried an MG-34 light machine gun, held at the hip with the bipod folded. The third carried a carabiner 98K and appeared to be directing movement. They advanced upslope in a shallow arc, scanning ahead but not laterally. Their spacing was tighter than earlier patrols, approximately 5 meters apart. This indicated readiness to engage rather than reconnaissance. At 16:39, the element halted. The soldier with a rifle pointed toward the ridge crest and spoke briefly. The medic could not hear the words, but observed the direction indicated. The MG-34 gunner moved to a kneeling position and deployed the bipod, orienting the weapon downslope rather than toward the medic's position. This suggested they were preparing to cover another maneuver element rather than conduct a close search. At 16:44, the medic made a critical assessment. If the German element advanced further upslope, the depression would fall within their immediate search area. He evaluated the possibility of moving the wounded again, but determined it would be too slow and noisy. He placed his right hand on the grip of the M1911A1 pistol, keeping it pressed against the ground to avoid movement. The pistol was loaded with full metal jacket .45 ACP ammunition, muzzle velocity approximately 253 meters per second from the 127mm barrel. Effective range was limited, but at distances under 25 meters, it was lethal. The medic did not intend to engage unless discovery was imminent. At 16:51, one German soldier detached from the element and began moving toward the depression. He advanced cautiously, weapon held low but ready. The distance closed steadily. 55 meters, then 45, then 38. The medic counted each step internally, maintaining awareness of angles and cover. At 16:57, the soldier stopped at approximately 32 meters. He knelt and scanned the ground. His line of sight passed over the depression, but did not settle. The medic remained completely still. His heart rate increased, but his breathing remained controlled. At 17:01, the soldier stood and waved the others forward. They shifted position, but did not approach the depression directly. Instead, they moved along the ridge crest, parallel to the medic's position, at a distance of approximately 30 to 40 meters. At 17:06, the medic observed a critical moment. One of the wounded men involuntarily coughed. The sound was brief but audible. The nearest German soldier paused and turned his head. The medic reacted immediately by placing his hand over the wounded man's mouth and applying firm pressure to suppress further sound. The wounded man did not resist. The German soldier listened for approximately 5 seconds. No further sound followed. He turned away and resumed movement. By 17:12, the element had moved past the medic sector. They continued northward along the ridge, eventually disappearing from view at 17:19. The medic did not pursue or observe further. He remained focused on maintaining concealment and stabilizing the wounded. He did not fire a shot. No direct engagement occurred, but the proximity and intent of enemy forces had narrowed significantly. As daylight continued to fade, the medic understood that the nature of the threat was changing. Enemy forces were no longer probing uncertain ground. They were consolidating control. The margin for concealment was shrinking, and further contact was increasingly likely as night approached. At 17:31 hours on October 17th, 1944, ambient light dropped below the threshold for reliable visual identification at distance. The sun had moved behind the western slope of the ridge, and the tree line absorbed remaining illumination unevenly. Contrast increased. Movement became harder to detect, but any sound now carried farther in the cooling air. Temperature fell steadily, estimated at 4 degrees Celsius by 17:45. Moisture condensed on equipment and exposed skin. The medic's hand stiffened despite periodic flexing. He repositioned his weight incrementally every 10 to 15 minutes to prevent numbness without producing detectable movement. At 17:52, German activity resumed, now altered in method. Instead of dispersed patrols, movement occurred along predictable axes, the ridge crest and the road below. The medic detected this through sound patterns, bootsteps in groups, halts at regular intervals, metallic clatter from equipment being set down. This suggested establishment of temporary control points rather than sweeping patrols. At 18:03, A German sentry position was established approximately 120 meters north of the medic's location, identifiable by repeated pacing within a confined arc and periodic weapon manipulation sounds. A second position was established downslope to the west, inferred from overlapping sound coverage. The ridge was being secured for night. Enemy doctrine favored night containment rather than aggressive clearing, unless resistance was confirmed. The medic recognized this shift. It reduced immediate movement pressure, but increased the danger discovery at first light. Between 1810 and 1900 hours, the medic focused on survival measures. He checked circulation distal to the tourniquet every 15 minutes, loosening and retightening marginally to prevent tissue necrosis while controlling hemorrhage. He monitored the abdominal casualty's breathing, which had slowed to approximately 16 breaths per minute but remained shallow. The casualty drifted in and out of consciousness. The medic did not administer additional morphine. At 1827, the medic consumed a small portion of a care ration biscuit, breaking it into fragments and chewing slowly to minimize sound. He swallowed without water. He retained the wrapper to avoid reflective litter. At 1844, the wind shifted again, now from the northeast at approximately 6 kilometers per hour. This altered sound transmission. Distant noises became sharper. The medic used this interval to adjust concealment, pulling leaf litter over exposed bandages and smoothing disturbed soil with the back of his hand. At 1906, a German flare rose to the south, approximately 400 meters away. It illuminated the terrain briefly with white light, suspended by a small parachute. The medic froze. The flare burned for approximately 22 seconds before extinguishing. No direct illumination reached the depression, but the event confirmed active night security. At 1919, the medic heard voices again, closer than before. 2 soldiers moved along the ridge crest from north to south, stopping every 20 to 30 meters. Their conversation was subdued. One carried a lantern, briefly shielded, then extinguished. The lantern was not used continuously, indicating caution rather than routine. At 1928, the pair halted approximately 45 meters from the medic's position. One soldier sat down. The other remained standing. The medic inferred a rest or observation pause. He remained motionless for the duration. At 1941, the soldiers resumed movement and continued southward. No search was conducted. From 1945 to 2110, the ridge remained under intermittent observation, but no close patrols approached the depression. The medic experienced cumulative fatigue, and his neck muscles ached from maintaining a low profile. His eyes strained to maintain awareness in low light. He alternated between short periods of intense focus and controlled rest, never fully relaxing. At 2118, distant small arms fire resumed to the east. The pattern suggested an engagement several kilometers away, possibly a renewed Allied advance. The medic could not confirm. He noted only that enemy forces on the ridge did not redeploy in response. At 2137, one of the wounded men developed shivering consistent with hypothermia. The medic responded by pressing his own body closer to share heat and by insulating the casualty with additional cloth and leaf litter. He avoided sudden movements. He monitored breathing and pulse continuously for the next 20 minutes. At 2202, German activity increased briefly. A small group moved downslope, passing approximately 70 meters west of the medic's position. They spoke quietly, then dispersed. The medic interpreted this as rotation of sentries or repositioning rather than a search. At 2231, the medic considered the possibility of self-evacuation at night. He assessed the wounded men's condition and terrain. The femoral casualty could not walk. The abdominal casualty could not be moved without significant risk. Carrying either would require standing and prolonged movement. The probability of detection was assessed as high. He rejected the option. Between 2240 and 010, the medic maintained a static posture. Time perception slowed. He tracked minutes mentally to prevent disorientation. He periodically touched the ground to maintain sensory awareness and avoid microsleep. At 018 on October 18, 1944, the ridge grew quieter. Enemy movement decreased significantly. This was consistent with standard night routine after initial security was established. At 0:36, light rain began, fine and steady. It dampened sound further, but increased cold exposure. The medic adjusted bandages to prevent saturation. He used his body to shield the wounded from direct rainfall. From 0:45 to 3:30, no close enemy movement occurred. The medic remained awake, monitoring, adjusting, waiting. Fatigue became severe. Reaction time slowed. He compensated by narrowing focus to immediate surroundings. At 3:47, the rain stopped. The sky began to lighten imperceptibly toward the east. The medic recognized the approach of dawn. He understood that concealment would become more difficult as light returned. The situation was unchanged in structure, but altered in urgency. Enemy forces held the ridge. Friendly forces had not yet arrived. The medic remained alone with the wounded, aware that the next phase would be decided not by movement, but by visibility and timing. At 4:02 hours on October 18, 1944, ambient light increased marginally. The eastern horizon showed a pale gradient, insufficient for clear identification, but enough to outline terrain contours. The ridge line became distinguishable again. Shadows shortened but remained diffuse under low cloud cover. Temperature was estimated at 3 degrees Celsius. Moisture from the earlier rain clung to foliage and uniforms. The medic adjusted his posture at 4:06, carefully redistributing weight from his left elbow to his right forearm. He noted stiffness in his fingers and reduced grip strength. He flexed each finger sequentially inside the mud-caked glove to restore circulation, taking approximately 2 minutes to complete the movement without noise. At 4:14, he checked both wounded men. The femoral casualty was semi-conscious, responding to pressure but not opening his eyes. Distal pulse was weak but present. Skin was cold and pale. The abdominal casualty's breathing was irregular, with brief pauses of 2 to 3 seconds. The medic placed his ear close to the casualty's chest, counting respirations manually. He did not administer further medication. At 4:28, German movement resumed earlier than during the previous morning. Footsteps were audible along the ridge crest to the north. The cadence suggested multiple individuals, spaced at regular intervals. This was consistent with a pre-dawn security sweep, intended to confirm control before daylight. At 4:36, 3 soldiers emerged into partial view approximately 90 meters north of the medic's position. They moved in a line, weapons held ready but not raised. One carried an MP-40. The others carried carabiner 98K rifles. Their pace was slow, scanning ground and tree bases rather than the horizon. They advanced southward along the ridge crest. At 4:44, the medic assessed that the patrol's path would bring them within 40 meters of the depression if they continued on their current axis. He prepared contingencies. He ensured the M1911A1 pistol was accessible, safety disengaged, finger index along the frame. He reviewed angles of fire mentally, identifying the nearest approach path, and limited fields of fire due to vegetation. At 4:51, the patrol halted. One soldier knelt and examined the ground. The medic observed the soldier touch disturbed leaves near a shallow scrape approximately 25 meters from the depression. This scrape had likely been used by a member of the medic's unit during the initial engagement. The soldier gestured to the others. At 4:56, the patrol shifted formation. 2 soldiers advanced downslope, slightly, angling toward the depression. The third remained on the ridge crest, providing overwatch. This was a deliberate search maneuver rather than incidental movement. The medic remained still. He placed his left hand over the mouth of the femoral casualty preemptively, applying steady pressure to suppress involuntary sounds. He adjusted his body to block line of sight into the depression from the approaching soldier's angle. At 5:02, the 2 advancing soldiers closed to approximately 28 meters. Their boots disturbed wet leaves, producing a soft but audible sound. They paused frequently, scanning and listening. One soldier raised his rifle slightly, barrel angled downward. At 5:07, a critical moment occurred. The abdominal casualty exhaled sharply, producing a brief but distinct sound. The medic immediately increased pressure with his left hand and leaned forward, pressing his chest against the casualty's shoulders to immobilize him. The sound ceased. One of the German soldiers stopped. He raised his head and listened. The medic did not move. The soldier's posture remained tense for approximately 8 seconds. The second soldier shifted his weight, adjusting footing. At 5:09, the Overwatch soldier on the ridge crest spoke quietly. The words were not intelligible, but the tone suggested impatience rather than alarm. The two advancing soldiers exchanged a glance. At 5:11, they resumed movement, but not toward the depression. Instead, they angled slightly westward, moving along a contour line rather than descending further. The medic observed their backs as they passed across his peripheral vision at a distance of approximately 22 meters. At 5:18, the patrol regrouped and continued southward along the ridge crest. By 5:26, they were no longer visible. The medic did not relax his posture for several minutes afterward. At 5:34, full dawn approached. Light levels increased rapidly. Visibility extended to approximately 120 meters in open areas. The medic assessed that concealment would deteriorate quickly. He considered moving the wounded again, but determined that any movement now would be easily observed. At 5:47, artillery fire resumed, closer than before. Shell impacts were audible within 1 to 2 kilometers to the east. The pattern suggested preparatory fire rather than harassing fire. The medic inferred that friendly forces might be advancing, but no confirmation was possible. At 6:03, German activity increased abruptly. Multiple voices were heard to the west. Equipment clattered. One engine noise was audible briefly, likely a light vehicle on the road below. The medic interpreted this as repositioning rather than withdrawal. At 6:12, a German squad moved downslope from the ridge crest approximately 60 meters north of the medic's position. They did not approach the depression. Instead, they oriented toward the road. This suggested a shift in focus away from the ridge interior. At 6:24, small arms fire erupted to the east, closer than earlier engagements. The sound of automatic fire and rifle shots overlapped. German voices became louder and more urgent. The ridge was no longer the primary focus. At 6:31, the medic observed movement upslope from the west. Figures appeared briefly between trees, moving cautiously but with purpose. The silhouettes differed from German equipment profiles. Helmets were lower and rounder. Rifles were longer. The medic did not signal. At 6:36, a U.S. infantry fire team emerged clearly at a distance of approximately 70 meters. They advanced cautiously, weapons raised. The medic remained concealed, waiting for proximity and certainty. At 6:42, the fire team halted. One soldier raised a hand signal. Another knelt. They scanned the ridge interior. The medic waited until they advanced to within 30 meters before moving. At 6:45, the medic raised his right arm slowly, palm open, identifying himself without standing. The movement was deliberate and controlled. The nearest U.S. soldier responded with a hand signal and approached cautiously. At 6:48, contact was established. The medic identified himself as a combat medic and indicated the wounded. Without speaking loudly, the U.S. soldier secured the immediate area, scanning outward. At 6:55, additional U.S. personnel arrived. A litter team was summoned. The wounded were prepared for evacuation. The medic assisted briefly, then withdrew to allow treatment. The decisive period ended not with combat, but with timing, concealment, and endurance. The medic had not fired his weapon. He had not moved significantly for over 24 hours. The ridge was now under friendly control. At 7:02 hours on October 18, 1944, the immediate area around the depression was secured by U.S. infantry. A perimeter was established extending approximately 50 meters in all directions. 2 soldiers took up overwatch positions facing west and south. Another moved downslope to observe the road. No enemy movement was detected within visual range. The medic remained kneeling beside the wounded as a second medic arrived with a larger aid kit. The original medic provided concise, factual information: time of tourniquet application, morphine dosages, plasma administration, observed symptoms, and changes in condition. No extraneous details were given. The exchange lasted less than 1 minute. At 7:08, The femoral casualty was placed on a collapsible litter. The tourniquet was left in place, marked clearly with time. The abdominal casualty was transferred next, handled carefully to minimize movement. Both were moved upslope toward a temporary casualty collection point established near the ridge crest. At 7:15, the medic stood fully upright for the first time since the previous afternoon. He experienced transient dizziness due to prolonged static posture and dehydration. He stabilized himself by placing a hand against a tree trunk. He did not sit. At 7:19, he conducted a rapid self-assessment. No injuries were present. Clothing was saturated with moisture and mud. His hands showed reduced dexterity and mild tremor consistent with fatigue and cold exposure. He retained full cognitive awareness. At 7:24, the medic was instructed to remain in place while the unit continued clearing operations. German forces had withdrawn eastward under pressure from advancing U.S. elements. Sporadic fire was still audible but moving away. At 7:41, the medic assisted briefly with treatment of another wounded soldier discovered approximately 90 meters south of the original depression. The soldier had sustained a grazing gunshot wound to the scalp and a minor shrapnel injury to the forearm. Treatment was completed on site. The medic's movements were slower than usual but precise. At 8:03, the ridge was declared secure. U.S. forces established defensive positions oriented east and southeast. Engineers began clearing obstacles along the road. No further enemy contact occurred in the immediate vicinity. At 8:17, the medic was directed to the casualty collection point. He reported again on the condition of the two men he had treated overnight. One had regained partial consciousness during evacuation. The other remained critical. Outcomes were unknown at that time. At 8:29, the medic removed his aid bag and set it on the ground. He inventoried remaining supplies methodically. Bandages depleted, plasma expended, morphine reduced to 2 syrettes, sulfur powder partially used. He cleaned visible blood from his hands using water from a canteen, then resecured the bag. At 8:42, he was given permission to rest. He sat against the base of a tree, helmet still on, weapon still holstered. He did not sleep immediately. He observed the ridge and listened to ongoing activity. His breathing normalized gradually. At 9:11, he consumed a full ration and water. Appetite returned slowly. He remained alert to sound and movement, despite exhaustion. At 9:34, he provided a brief factual account to an officer documenting the engagement. The account focused on times, locations, and observed enemy activity. No personal interpretation was offered. The officer recorded the information and moved on. By late morning, the ridge had become a rear area. Casualty evacuation routes were established. Supply traffic increased along the road. The conditions that had defined the previous 24 hours, uncertainty, concealment, immediate threat, were no longer present. The medic's actions resulted in the survival of wounded men who would otherwise have been discovered or succumbed to their injuries. No enemy casualties were attributable to him. His effectiveness was measured not by engagement, but by endurance, restraint, and adherence to procedure under prolonged pressure. The episode did not alter the broader course of the campaign. The ridge was one of many positions taken and held during the advance. The medic returned to duty with his unit later that day. No formal recognition was recorded at that time. What was demonstrated was not innovation or exceptional force, but the sustained application of training in conditions of isolation, fatigue, and persistent threat. The outcome depended on timing, discipline, and the decision to remain unseen rather than to act decisively in combat. The situation resolved without spectacle. It concluded quietly, with the wounded removed, the position secured, and operations continuing as planned.